Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming here today. I want to thank President Park and Cook for inviting me to this wonderful institution, to the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. This is an institution that I think is an important example of civil society. It enriches the dialogue in South Korea and the Republic of Korea and beyond about regional and global issues, and it's a real pleasure to be here with them. I also very much look forward to the what I hope is a friendly conversation with Professor Hong Seung-ju. I hope the professor takes it easy on me and does not fail me for any of my responses. Look, we meet here at an incredibly important time. Usually history is something we read about, something that takes place in the distant past. I feel that we are very much now living in history, that we are living amidst the making and the unfolding of important events. Not just in my country, not just in the Republic of Korea, but in this part of the world and in the world at large. You have a new president here in this country. We still have a relatively new president in the United States. They are about to have their first one-on-one meeting. The stakes are high, given the issues including but not limited to North Korea. And also, I think in the last several days, we've had a reminder of the stakes in another sense. My country lost 7 brave young sailors in an accident at sea. And as you all know, a young American was unfairly arrested by North Korea and then mistreated. And essentially, though he died after he returned to the United States, he was a victim of his captivity and what was done to him there. And it was a stark reminder, again, of the not just political realities, but personal and human price and costs that are inherent in the status quo. What I want to do in my talk here today is I want to try to place the current situation in some historical context, to take a step back for a minute. Then I'd like to say a few things about the foreign policy of the Trump administration in the United States, talk about some of the changes I would like to see, my preferences, if you will, more than my predictions, and then end with a couple of thoughts about the world as, again, it is unfolding. And then I very much look forward to my conversation with Hong Seung-ju about a whole host of issues, and my sense is he and I will get more specific. So I'll speak, I've just flown here, so I'll speak at 36,000 feet, and then the professor and I can get down to sea level. Look, we meet here in the year 2017. You know, this is roughly a quarter of a century since the end of the Cold War. So we're about 25, 26, 27 years into this latest chapter or era of history, and we still call it, we still describe it as the post-Cold War world. And that is because we know where we've come from, but we still haven't been able to describe or determine exactly where we are, much less where we are going. Again, the history of this period is being written. It has not yet been written. What we know, though, is that 25 years after the end of the Cold War, many of the trends in the world are not what we would have wanted to see. This is an indirect way of saying that history did not begin with the election of Donald Trump. The title you're using for my lecture here today, A World in Disarray, it's the title of my book. And I chose that title nearly 2 years ago now. And I didn't know, obviously. I don't have a crystal ball. I had no way of knowing who was going to be the 45th President of the United States. I didn't know if it would be Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Senator Bernie Sanders, or 15 other Republicans, all of whom were seeking to be the next President of the United States at the time. And the only thing, though, I knew, the only thing I could be confident of is that whoever was the 45th President of the United States, when he or she took office in January 2017, this would be their inbox. This would be the world that would await them. You can choose just about anything when you run for President of the United States. You can choose your running mate, your vice president. You can choose your policies. You can choose what it is you say in your speeches. But if you win, the only thing you cannot choose is your inbox. And the only thing I knew for sure was that the inbox of the 45th president was going to be extremely full and extremely difficult. And there are several reasons why. One is because it had been roughly a quarter century since the end of the Cold War, this new president was going to begin without many of the structures of the Cold War. The Cold War was a dangerous time, I understand that. I was born in the early years of the Cold War. But the Cold War was also a very structured era of history, in part because of their nuclear weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union conducted their relations with considerable care. There were certain rules, formal and informal, about how they would manage their competition, so their competition did not lead to confrontation or, even worse, to nuclear escalation. But with the end of the Cold War, this discipline, this structure became a thing of the past. We had an early sign of that in 1990, when Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait. That is the sort of violation of sovereignty I believe never would have been allowed to take place when the Soviet Union was at its peak and when the Cold War was at its height. So it was already one of the first signs of a world that was less disciplined. And over the following years, we had many more signs in Europe and the former Yugoslavia, as well as in other parts of the world. Structurally, in part because of technology, in part because of globalization, what emerged was a very different kind of world. The Cold War was a world dominated by two centers, two concentrations of power. Not simply NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but a large part of the world clearly led by the United States, another part of the world, another set of countries led by the Soviet Union. Again, two principal concentrations of power. There were others, and I understand China was already somewhat going its own way and so forth. But then there were other countries who described themselves as non-aligned. But again, this was a bipolar world. The world we have today is of countless poles. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. Some of them countries, some of them not, some of them corporations, some of them individuals. This is a very different world. This is a world not of concentrated power, but this is a world of distributed power. And as a result, it's a far more difficult world to organize simply because there are so many more entities or actors who are independent and or who are capable. A third force taking place is globalization. Globalization is a word we often use. People mean different things by it, but I believe globalization is the reality of these enormous flows of just about everything, whether it's computer viruses or real viruses, greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, people, and be they tourists or terrorists, guns, dollars, euros, you name it. just about everything and everyone across borders, and with incredible volume, with incredible velocity. This is what globalization is, and in some ways it's the defining reality of our era. It's not surprising then, with the end of the Cold War, the rise of all these new centers of power, the advance of globalization, that many of the arrangements in the world, many of the institutions in the world that were created right after World War II were increasingly inadequate. There wasn't such a thing as anything digital or cyber, so of course we didn't have institutions that could deal with that. But even something like the United Nations increasingly had fallen behind. Think about it. If I were to hand out a piece of paper and a pencil to every one of you sitting here today, how many of you do you believe would produce a UN Security Council that looked exactly like the UN Security Council we have, with Great Britain, France, the United States, Russia, and China as the 5 permanent members, leaving out all sorts of other countries? I would hazard the guess that probably none of you would design a Security Council today that is identical to the Security Council we have. And this is true of many other institutions, that the great institutions of modern life, many of them date back to the 1940s or 50s, but here we are 60, 70 years later, and many of them, the change, the adaptation has not kept pace. So we have all of these changes in the world that I think explains why it has become a world of disarray. And I also think at times, if I may be self-critical of my own country, the United States, at times we have added to it. And I think the United States has added to it both by things we have done, for example, the 2003 war in Iraq, which I believe introduced new instabilities into the Middle East, but also things we haven't done. And there, for example, I would suggest such things as the many opportunities that the previous president, Mr. Obama, had to use military force in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, and he did not. And I think what this shows that in foreign policy, both what you do and what you don't do can be consequential. Indeed, what you don't do can be every bit as consequential as those things that you actually do. But however we got to where we are, and you may have your own list, you may have your own analysis, we are where we are. And I think the examples of a world in disarray are many. The Middle East is perhaps the prime example. You've had a civil war in Syria that's not just a civil war, but is now a regional war. And just the other day, we saw the potential for something worse than that when the United States shot down a Syrian aircraft and Russia then made threats against the United States. We have a war there that has led to more than half the population of Syria to become displaced, to become homeless. 5 or 6 million are refugees, even more are displaced within their own borders, probably 400,000 to 500,000 people, most of whom were innocent civilians, have lost their lives. So you've got the humanitarian and historical tragedy that is Syria, and this is a war that shows no signs of, or few signs of slowing down. You've got the failed state that is Libya. You have the very weak state that is Iraq. You have a growing proxy war in Yemen. And there are any number of other disputes and conflicts within the, and unsettled claims within the region. So the Middle East was, is, and I fear will be the most unsettled part of the world for some time to come. In Europe, which for much of the post-World War II and post-Cold War era was the most stable part of the world, we've had the return of aggression and geopolitics in the form of Russian invasion of Crimea, its occupation of Crimea, of Ukraine, their invasion of Ukraine and their occupation of Crimea. And then we've also had all sorts of questions about the future of the European Union, which along with NATO was one of the two great pieces of statecraft that added stability to post-World War II Europe. And as a result, Europe, which had been taken for granted as the most stable part of the world, suddenly there were fundamental questions again about its future. Here in Asia, and I don't think you need a visitor from the United States to tell you, you've got any number of issues. You've got the question of China's rise and China's relationship to its many neighbors. You've got the question of North Korea, its massive conventional military might, its nuclear arsenal, and increasingly its missile capabilities, and what that means not just for you, but for your neighbors, but potentially for the entire world. More broadly in East Asia, you've got any number of territorial and other conflicts, competing claims, and a lack of institutions to cope with them. And elsewhere in Asia and South Asia, you have two nuclear-armed states, India and Pakistan, who have essentially very little relationship. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had more of a relationship than India and Pakistan have now. Pakistan now is the world's largest producer. It's got the world's fastest growing inventory of nuclear weapons. Pakistan also has more of the world's terrorists than perhaps any other country. And the possibility for conflict between India and Pakistan cannot be ruled out. In other parts of the world, the challenges are different. In places like Africa and Latin America, the problems there are more problems within countries. It's not so much geopolitics, but it's problems of governance, it's problems of economic development, it's problems of civil war, but they're problems all the same, and we see it close to where I live in Venezuela, or we see it in places like South Sudan or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then, as if all of this were not enough, we then have the reality of all the challenges of globalization, and the ability and willingness of the world to come together to deal with them is simply not there. Or put it another way, there's a tremendous gap between, on one hand, the challenges presented by globalization, and on the other hand, the ability of the world to deal with them. One of the most frequent phrases used by people in the field of international relations is the phrase international community. But the reality is there is not much international community. There is not much agreement on what is to be done to deal with globalization, and there's not much agreement on who is to do it. So as a result, there's a large gap, in some cases a growing gap, between the various challenges produced by globalization and the response of the world. So this is what Mr. Trump inherited when he became president some 5 months ago. It was very much a world in disarray. And my second point, and it's one I'm not happy to make, but I'll make it all the same, is I believe that many of the things he has done has added to it. That Mr. Trump inherited a difficult inbox, and I believe in some ways he has added to that inbox. I think he's done it at times by what he has said. Phrases like America first has led many of our allies to wonder, if America's first, where does that leave them? Does that mean they're second or something else? Because one of the things that makes an alliance is that no one's first. When you have an alliance, we're on equal footing. An attack on one is an attack on all. We are there for you, you are there for us. So I think the phrase America first has raised certain questions that have been reinforced by some of the things that Mr. Trump and others have said about our willingness to honor some of our alliance commitments, and this has come up particularly in Europe. under the NATO treaty. So it's raised some questions about, again, the dependability or reliability of the United States. Another thing that Mr. Trump has done is he's raised questions about what had been the traditional American commitment to free trade. Now, let me be clear, he was not the first person to do this. Indeed, in our recent election, one of the very few issues that Secretary Clinton, Senator Sanders, and Mr. Trump all agreed on is all three opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this represents quite a departure from the traditional American embrace of free trade. I think that's unfortunate. I think free trade has been a powerful good for the world. I think it's been a real engine of job creation. I think it's been an engine of development. It's been a way to strengthen friends and allies. It's been a way to integrate adversaries. And I understand that certain companies and certain individuals have paid a price for it, but there are and were ways to compensate them and to help retrain them and reposition them for new opportunities. But I think what we have seen in my country is a fairly broad rejection of aspects of free trade. And one of the first things Mr. Trump did as president was to take the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Elsewhere, some of the things he's done, clearly now there is less of an emphasis in the United States on the centrality of democracy and human rights in our foreign policy, less of a promotion of them, less concern about when others do not respect or honor them. We've seen changes in some traditional American policies about immigration, about our willingness to accept refugees. And then we also, most recently, rejected, or rather took the United States out of the Paris climate change agreement. Now, it's not all one-sided, and I think there's things that this administration has done that are welcome and that I support. I believe the willingness to use military force after chemical weapons were used in Syria by the government there was a healthy sign. It's important that no one be able to use any weapon of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear, and get away with it without paying an enormous price. So I thought it was a very positive development that the United States responded to Syrian use of chemicals. Closer to where we are today, I think the message delivered to the Chinese leadership when they visited Mar-a-Lago, that American strategic patience with North Korea had essentially run out, and that several decades of drift in which North Korea had been permitted by the world to advance its nuclear and missile capabilities, the patience and tolerance of this was fast coming to an end, and that China, more than any other country, now had the responsibility to do something about it. I believe delivering that message to the Chinese leadership was a very positive development. And even, by the way, in the realm of climate change, where I disagree with what the administration did, the fact is American policy will not change much because the federal government only controls certain parts of American policy on climate change. And what happens at the state level and the city level and on the part of American corporations will, in the long run, probably matter much more than whether the United States is or is not a member of the Paris Agreement. But my point is simply what I said, that I think overall, if my first point was that 25 years after the end of the Cold War, there already was a world in disarray, I think it's fair to say that in the last 5 months, Mr. Trump has added to it by what he has done and said. As you might expect, therefore, I am hoping, not predicting, I am hoping there are some changes in American foreign policy to come. And I would hope that Mr. Trump would come to appreciate that while the world is an imperfect place, and as I said, many of the institutions and arrangements are no longer adequate, the task ahead is more to adapt them, to modernize them, than it is to get rid of them. Or to put it another way, we ought to be preserving and adapting rather than disrupting and discarding. So we need, I think, a different approach to the world. And I think it's still important to embrace alliances, be they in Europe or in Asia. I think it's important to embrace institutions. I think it's important to embrace global trade arrangements. And where they are unfair or where they are imperfect, then they need to be improved. But it's just that I think we ought to build on the positives of what we have, and we ought to adapt and modernize where things fall short. There needs to be much greater global cooperation on global challenges. My own thinking on this, and it's something I've talked about and written about, and President Park mentioned it here, is the idea of sovereign obligation. That when we hear the word sovereignty, almost automatically we all think about sovereign rights, the right to be left alone, the right to do what we want to do within our own territory, the right not to be invaded. Okay, I understand that. Rights are important. But we also have to understand in a global world, in an interconnected world, what goes on now inside any country in the world is not its business alone. If there's the outbreak of a deadly virus because of globalization, that can threaten the health of millions of people around the globe. Greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, they don't respect borders. Wherever these gases come from, they will affect the climate everywhere. As my own country learned on 9/11, terrorists coming from the most remote regions of the world can get on an airplane with a tool as simple as a box cutter and lead to the death of 3,000 innocent men, women, and children. As we've seen time and time again, people can get on the internet and invade privacy, interfere with elections, disrupt what corporations do, that we're so connected in this world that with that connectivity doesn't simply give us great efficiency, it also gives us tremendous vulnerability. My point is simply that in virtually every aspect of modern life now, we cannot simply say sovereignty is absolute and what goes on within our borders is only our business alone if those things have the potential to affect others and affect them for the worse. So what we need to start to do is to move towards, I believe, what I call Global Order 2.0, where we respect the basics of sovereignty. We do not want to see countries invading one another. We don't want to see repeats of what Saddam Hussein did to Kuwait in 1990. We don't want to see repeats of what Vladimir Putin's Russia did to Ukraine. So we want to keep the best of sovereign rights. We want to protect countries from interference from abroad. But with those rights come obligations. And sovereign governments have to make sure that nothing goes on within their borders that is a threat to the welfare of others. So this means not to house or harbor terrorists, not to allow hackers to interfere with the free and safe use of the digital domain. It means to police one's territory so there's not outbreaks of disease, or if there is an outbreak, that it's dealt with. It means not to develop weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems that can reach beyond borders. So we need to move towards this world of sovereign obligation, and we need to decide what are the rules, what are the principles by which this world would operate. We need to provide incentives, in some cases inducements for countries to live up to them, and we need to have penalties. We need to have a way of enforcing this system. Now look, I'm many things. I am not a naive academic. I've spent a lot of my life in government, working in the American Defense Department, State Department, at the National Security Council. I understand the gap between what I am describing and what exists in the world, My argument is simply this, that we had better narrow this gap as we move into the 21st century, or this will be not simply a 21st century of disarray, this will be a 21st century of something much worse. And again, the entire reality of living in a global world is nothing stays local for long. One way or another, virtually everything that may begin locally gets on the highway of globalization and spreads elsewhere. So we now have an interest what goes on in virtually every corner of the globe. So while we respect and keep sovereignty as the basis of international relations, we need to also introduce the idea that with it comes obligations as well as rights. Now, I'm not naive in another way. I understand that what I'm saying is not likely to be embraced by my own president. It's very hard to square what I have just said with the doctrine of America first. So it may mean that many of these ideas will have to be advocated by others for the time being, by the European Union or other individual countries, including this one, the Republic of Korea, if people in government agree with them. It may be that my own, this administration will evolve. It may be that people in Congress or elsewhere agree to these principles. It may have to wait in some cases for the next president or the president after that. But my prediction is, one way or another, this will by necessity become a central idea to the 21st century because there's no alternative in a global world. We will either find ways to manage globalization, or globalization in a negative sense will overwhelm all of us. So where are we then? And I want to stop here because I don't want to go on too long and abuse my welcome, and I look forward to the conversation, at least I think I look forward to the conversation with the very demanding professor. The question is, how will we operate in the world? And the question is, as I was suggesting, it's quite possible that the United States is not going to play its traditional role. That we now have in office a president, an individual who does not see in certain areas the value of the United States playing its traditional role. That may be the case for some time. The question then is, can anyone else do it? And my own view is probably not. I cannot identify any other country or group of countries that's willing and able to play the sort of role that the United States has played. China is mentioned by some, but I simply don't think this is China's priority. I think China's priority is more to maintain political order at home, to maintain employment. And I think when it approaches foreign policy, its foreign policy is mainly designed to reinforce these two goals, political order at home and the strength of the economy. I do not see signs that China is going about its foreign policy in ways that directly benefit others. I think Chinese foreign policy is mainly about a rather narrow definition of China's interest. Other countries like Russia, well, Russia doesn't want to strengthen the status quo in many cases so much as undermine it. It clearly has tried to do that in Europe, in the Middle East, and so forth. And other countries, whether it's in Europe or Japan or India or you name it, simply lack the capabilities or the outlook or both to take on a large international role. So I think the honest answer is absent the United States playing a leading role, and I want to emphasize a leading role, not a unilateral role, it's hard to me to see how the world becomes a more orderly place. So it's quite possible that what I've described as a world of disarray will be the world not simply of the present, but the world of the future. And I think that is likely not simply where we are, but where we are heading. And I think the challenge will be for countries around the world, including this one, where it disagrees with the United States, to try to persuade the United States that it may want to rethink some of its policies, and where the United States won't, that countries may have to look to other partners to try to bring about regional or global arrangements that are in our collective interests. And my own hope is that sooner rather than later, the United States will begin to embrace a more traditional role in the region and the world. But even if it were to, again, there are powerful forces out there. That's where I began. So I want to end where I began. That we've now reached a point in history where there's more capacity and more hands than ever before, where globalization is a really strong phenomenon, and where the institutional arrangements we have in place are simply inadequate to the challenge and to the task. So the end of the Cold War, despite the predictions of some, did not lead to an end of history. The end of the Cold War did not lead to an age of perpetual peace. What it did was lead to a very different era of history with very real and in some cases growing challenges. And here we are in 2017. It's only the second decade of this still young and new century. And I think the real challenge for individuals, for countries, for governments, is to adapt their foreign policies to the realities of a 21st century. My thinking is that we do have to move towards a concept of sovereign obligation, where we, again, accept responsibilities and obligations as well as rights. And we do this not simply as a form of philanthropy or charity or idealism. We do it as a form of realism. That in a global age, we cannot be safe, we cannot be secure, we cannot be prosperous, we cannot be free without the collective efforts of many. So I think that is the task that we need to set for ourselves. And I want to thank you for asking me to introduce some of these ideas today. And I look forward to my conversation with the former foreign minister. And I look forward to any comments or criticisms or alternative ideas you may have to present. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Han.